Good afternoon, and thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium 264, titled How Evangelical Critics View Mormon Origins. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. Please type any questions that you may have for our presenter into the Whova app, and they will be addressed during a question and answer period at the end of the session. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation. Continuing Ryan Wimmer's theme from the 2018 Sunstone Symposium of why evangelicals fail to convert Mormons, we turn to how Joseph Smith and the Mormon origins compared to fundamentalist Christianity historically. Evangelicals frequently use dichotomies such as Mormonism versus biblical Christianity, Joseph Smith versus the Bible, etc., highlighting the inconsistencies between the two. This presentation argues that, when compared to the Bible, Joseph Smith possesses superior historical documentation and witnesses to founding events. The beginnings of Christianity suffer from similar and greater inconsistencies and historical problems. This weakness of Christian ministries to Mormons results in very few ex-Mormons becoming another type of Christian. And I want to introduce our speaker before we begin. Ryan Wimmer received a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Utah and a Master's of Arts from Brigham Young University. He has presented at Sunstone, the Mormon History Association, and other historical conferences. I will now turn our time over to our presenter so that he can begin his presentation.
Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to this session. I do at the outset need to point out I had a very difficult time coming up with how to title this session. I actually can't remember what my original title was. The title on there now is what came from the Sunstone board, and they contacted me to see if I was fine with it, and I was good. But if you read the synopsis, that is exactly where I'm going with this. So if the title doesn't exactly capture what I'm doing, the synopsis written up certainly did. That's why I put another couple of titles that might capture a little more Mormon origins versus Christian beginnings, or Joseph Smith versus the Bible. So this is taken off from something I started a couple of years ago. I presented at Sunstone about why evangelicals don't do very good when they're trying to convert Mormons. And I decided to explore a little bit more on some problems in their message. And so I'm presenting this one today. If anyone saw that one, there will be some overlap because some of the area is the same, but most of it's completely different. So as you know, evangelicals often have they'll write books, they have articles, Joseph Smith versus the Bible, Joseph Smith versus Jesus, and even more recently, they came out with 2 new books. And the historical Jesus and the historical Joseph Smith, Jesus Resurrection and Joseph's Visions, and the Living Hope Ministries one, that's probably 15, 20 years old. But I'm just showing that this approach is still there. What I'm going to do I've never seen anyone do this before, but I'm really going to compare Christian origins with Mormon origins and the historical sources upon which they are based. And we'll kind of see how that works. And as I was doing it, it naturally flowed into, I did a little bit on some of the inconsistencies in both tradition origins. If we get to that, I'm not bound determined to get to that piece, but if we do, that all the better. All right. So in order to compare the origins of Mormonism with Christianity, we need to view what types of sources we are dealing with. With Mormonism, the documentation is massive. We have firsthand written accounts by those who experienced it, and we know who these people were. There are diaries, newspaper accounts, legal documents, letters, autobiographies. How does Christianity origins compare? Well, we've got the New Testament Gospels, which is, I'm focusing more on the life, the beginnings with Jesus. So the focus here will be with the Gospels. So there's far less. Because the topic is Christian beginnings, our focus, like I was saying, will be on the Gospels. Many are aware that there are discrepancies in the Gospel accounts, some of which we might discuss later. A common response to this is that there are always discrepancies in eyewitness testimonies, and therefore we should expect the Gospel accounts to be different. This is one of the main points made in Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. But the problem is none of them actually claim to be eyewitnesses. So please bear with me as I go through some of the Gospels. See, some of you may know it, but I need to lay the foundation so that you'll see where I'm going with this. In other than ultra-conservative apologetic corners, New Testament scholars are nearly universal in believing Mark was the first gospel written around 70 AD. The earliest record we have of the Gospel of Mark comes from church historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, quoting Papias in the early 2nd century as saying Mark was the interpreter of Peter and that he wrote accurately what Peter told him. Papias in turn was himself quoting another person he identified as the elder, but we don't know who that is. There are reasons many New Testament scholars doubt some of these claims by Papias. For one, he spoke of a Gospel of Matthew as well, that Matthew collected the oracles or sayings in the Hebrew language and interpreted them the best he could. But scholars are pretty universal that our Gospel of Matthew was never written in Hebrew. It was originally written in Greek, and that Matthew, and of course Matthew's not a collection of sayings. It's a narrative. So whatever Gospel of Matthew Papias was referring to is no longer existent. It is therefore possible Papias was also in error about Mark, and we just don't really know what he was referring to. Still, some scholars accept this tradition, while others believe the gospel was written anonymously and only later attributed to Mark. But the central point for this discussion is the origin of the Gospel of Mark and who wrote it can't be established with any type of certainty. So the Gospel of Matthew's authorship is even more sketchy. As already discussed, we can't really put much into what Papias said on it. Therefore, the first attribution of authorship to the Apostle Matthew is Irenaeus in the late 2nd century. The most widely accepted theory of how the synoptic Gospels were written among New Testament scholars, including conservative scholars, is the two-source hypothesis. This hypothesis is that the authors of Matthew and Luke relied upon Mark and a second undiscovered source of Jesus' sayings referred to as Q. Even Christian apologists such as Craig Blomberg, who is pictured in the slide, doesn't deny the explanatory power of the two-source hypothesis. It is difficult to imagine an eyewitness such as Matthew, who was with Jesus for lots of these events, having to rely on other sources in order to write his gospel, and not to mention he also never identifies himself as the author and speaks in third person. The author of Matthew is just simply unknown, regardless of any insistence by conservatives. And most scholars date this after 70 AD, somewhere in the 80s usually. The authorship of Luke's and Acts is typically attributed to a traveling companion Paul named Luke. N.T. Wright, a well-known New Testament scholar, believes the tradition, but admits the authorship cannot be stated with any certainty. Other scholars doubt the writer was a traveling companion of Paul due to the conflicts between what is written about Paul in Acts and what Paul wrote himself. Therefore, like Matthew and Mark, the authorship of Luke cannot be established with certainty. Furthermore, even if it was a traveling companion of Paul, Paul was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus anyway. And I always like to mention this about Luke. He mentions that in the first 3 verses, they got stories passed down from eyewitnesses, although he doesn't identify who they are. But the one thing he doesn't say is that he was inspired or that what he's writing was infallible and inerrant. But that's not stopped anyone from making that claim on his behalf. And like Matthew, it's believed to have been relied on Mark, Q, and written close to the same time as Matthew. Gospel of John. This author is definitely unknown. It is believed to have been written or adopted by a group that scholars refer to as the Johannine community. It is usually dated around 90 to 95 AD, but sometimes as early as the 80s. Most popular traditions attribute the writing to John, the son of Zebedee. Other traditions attribute it to John the Elder, who supposedly wrote 2nd and 3rd John. Few scholars continue to argue this account was written by any of the biblical characters called John or by an eyewitness. The Christology of Jesus is so much higher in John than the synoptics, it could actually be argued effectively that the Johannine community believed in a different Jesus than the other synoptics, just as evangelicals claim often about the Mormon Jesus versus the Jesus of biblical Christianity. The book of John is so different, many scholars do not believe it tells the actual history. I already mentioned Christian apologist Craig Blomberg, and he admits most scholars do not view John as historical. Blomberg says, quote, "Can John be taken seriously as a historically trustworthy account of the life of Jesus in light of the combination of similarities and differences from the synoptics? Most modern scholars have thought not." Christian apologist Craig Evans acknowledged this during a formal debate in 2012. Answering if Jesus really said the I am statements contained in John, Craig Evans said, quote, "I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus." Evans goes on to refer to John as similar to a parable and wisdom literature, having some historical nuggets, but had you been there, you would have heard Jesus utter the I am statements. This actually, he almost sounds similar to certain Mormons today that kind of view the Book of Mormon that way. Apologist Mike Lacona, in a 2018 debate, he admitted the view that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the gospel is a minority view and acknowledges Jesus did not literally say the I am statements, but rather John changes what Jesus did and said implicitly to be explicitly. I've often wondered maybe that's what Joseph was doing with the inspired version of the Bible. He was just, changing it to what they meant to say explicitly, other than what he took from Adam Clark. Anyhow, in conclusion on the Gospels, they simply cannot be established, nor can it even be remotely concluded that they are certainly written by eyewitness accounts. Even if you believe maybe the traditions are right, it can't be established with any certainty. And no special pleading and mental gymnastics by Christian apologists can change this reality. J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity spends minimal time attempting to use the tradition discussed here to establish the Gospels as eyewitness accounts. Wallace seemed unaware of New Testament scholarship on the problems of establishing the Gospels as eyewitnesses. Without the witnesses themselves claiming to be a witness, a homicide detective like Wallace should be aware such claims are known in legal terms as hearsay. Therefore, his entire case fails before it even gets started. Now, let's compare this to Joseph Smith and Mormon origins. Joseph Smith comes out well ahead. The stories of Jesus' marvelous works and miracles are based on unknown authors written decades after the events. Furthermore, most of the manuscripts of these writings date to centuries after they were written and contain significant discrepancies that I might discuss later. There's also no doubt these manuscripts were tampered with, as evidenced by the longer ending of Mark, the addition of the story of woman taken in adultery, and the change in the Gospel of Luke about Jesus' baptism. Many of the miracles and marvelous works of Joseph Smith, on the other hand, are based on surviving first-hand accounts by actual eyewitnesses. The witnesses to the gold plates are far superior eyewitness accounts than anything contained in the biblical record. And this is true even if you believe it was all a visionary experience. They still say they saw them, and they're still a first-hand account. And we have the originals of these people that say it. All of them signed a testimony to having seen them. Several of them, such as Martin Harris and Dave Wimmer, gave independent accounts of their own experience. There are, of course, some differences in the accounts, such as, you wouldn't know from the signed account that Martin Harris actually had it separate with Joseph Smith. But it's still better than anything we have in the New Testament. And as Wallace argues in Cold Case Christianity, conflicts are to be expected with eyewitness accounts. But unlike what Wallace argues in his book, with the witnesses of the gold plates, we possess original documents that, unlike the New Testament writings, unarguably originate from the actual witnesses. No matter how many problems exist with the testimony of the Book of Mormon witnesses, and there are plenty, there's plenty of reasons to doubt it. But the documentation of these witnesses' claims is far superior to anything in the biblical accounts of the life of Jesus or his resurrection. Christian apologists love to argue that multiple people cannot share the same vision at the same time in the case of the resurrection, but they have to use a different standard of seeing visions when it comes to a far better documented account of witnesses sharing a vision. Like Jesus and other biblical characters, Joseph Smith as well is reported to have performed some miraculous healings. One of the first was Elsa Johnson in the spring of 1831. Johnson reportedly had a rheumatic arm, or basically was paralyzed. Joseph Smith responded to a conversation if there were any men on earth with the power to heal Johnson's arm. Joseph took Elsa by the hand and commanded her to be made whole in the name of Jesus Christ. Johnson raised her arm and reportedly was able to do her washing without any pain. Methodist preacher Ezra Booth was so impressed by the healing, and he joined the church. This story comes from a Campbellite source, Early History of the Disciples in the Western Reserve, Ohio, by A.S. Hayden, written in 1875, quoting a sermon by A. Hinsdale, August 3, 1870. Like the Gospels, the details of the story comes 50 years after the occurrence. Unlike the Gospels, however, the provenance of the story is known, as well as who was the author. The source is also from a not very sympathetic source towards Mormonism. In addition, it has never been disputed that this miracle is what converted Ezra Booth to join the church, although his membership didn't last long, so he must not have been that impressed. But the main point for the current discussion is that the miracle, although not an ironclad story, it is far better documented than any miracle story of the New Testament. That is what is very well documented, however, by first-person eyewitness accounts are Joseph Smith healings in Nauvoo, Illinois. Every student of Mormon history is aware that many were inflicted with malaria in the early days of settling the swamp at Nauvoo. What is known as the Day of Healing is well known and is also documented by eyewitnesses that are historically known to have been present when these things happened. One of the best accounts comes from the journal entry of Wilford Woodruff of July 1839. On July 22nd, Woodruff wrote, quote, "There was many sick among the saints on both sides of the river, and Joseph went through the midst of them, taking them by the hand and in a loud voice commanding them in the name of Jesus Christ to arise from their beds and be made whole. And they leaped from their beds and made whole by the power of God. Elder Elijah Fordham was one among them, and he with the rest of the sick rose from his bed and followed Joseph from house to house, and it was truly a time of rejoicing." Heber C. Kimball also recorded that on July 22nd, 1839, he wrote that Joseph arose from his bed and proceeded to go from house to house and from tent to tent upon the bank of the river, healing the sick. Joseph then traveled to Montrose, where he healed Brigham Young and the already mentioned Elijah Fordham. Parley P. Pratt also recalled the healing of Fordham, describing Fordham as having his eyes sunk in their sockets. The flesh was gone, and the paleness of death was upon him. Pratt then similarly described the healing by Joseph, that Fordham leaped from his bed. And Brigham Young recorded this as a day never to be forgotten. Now, there are many questions that can be raised about believing the events of the Day of Healing, whether or not it was actually God's supernatural powers or disease. For one, why did so many still die? Why was Joseph still unable to save his own father? But none of that really matters. The purpose of this, what I'm talking about, isn't to establish that supernatural powers were really in Joseph Smith, but simply to demonstrate this story is far better documented than any of the supernatural healing stories about Jesus. In fact, there's really no way to argue otherwise. We have the original documents from those that recorded the occurrences into their journals, as well as witnesses who wrote it down in later reminiscences. We have the original writings of these witnesses, and there's no question to authorship. Now, Joseph Smith's stories of the Restoration no doubt developed as time progressed, along with retroactive adjustments to the story. One example would be the restoration of the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthoods. There is no documentation mentioning the restoration of either priesthood by angelic visitations until 1834, 1835, which is 5 to 6 years after the ordination supposedly happened. The traditional story that both priesthoods were restored in the spring of 1829 is viewed as anachronistic by a large number of Mormon commentators and historians. There are similar issues like this in the life of Jesus. But once again, the problem is actually much larger, as the following example will demonstrate. Paul was the earliest Christian writer that we know of, and despite having supposedly met the actual apostles, never mentions once the important I am claims coming from Jesus as contained in the Gospel of John. These I am statements are by far the most extravagant claims to Jesus that leaves no doubt to his pre-existing his birth and that he is divine. Many become a Christian and be saved 1-800 numbers say to begin your Christian life by reading the Gospel of John. Yet our first Christian writer, who was writing only a couple decades after the death of Jesus, never mentions any of these large claims. Then 40 years after Jesus died, Mark, who never mentions it, and then a short time later, Matthew and Luke also. It's 60 to 70 years after Jesus died, we get the Gospel of John declaring Jesus said these words. Of course, the years these letters, epistles, and Gospels were written is estimated by scholars. Some date them much later than the generally accepted dating, as mentioned earlier. When viewing the documented manuscripts, it is a couple of centuries before we have a complete manuscript of the Gospel of John. Beyond that, there were doubtless some tampering with the Gospel of John, as with the story of the lady taken in adultery. But according to evangelicals who try to witness to Mormons, an individual should swallow these massive problems with the Gospel of John and the claims of Jesus in them and accept that John contains the actual words of Jesus, and yet question the priesthood story not being documented for 5 to 6 years after it supposedly happened. It's a much bigger gap. So I find sometimes the differing standards funny. And I know the predictable response is we're dealing with much older and ancient documents with the New Testament and should judge it differently. That said, that doesn't change it. It doesn't change the fact that it still is what it is. The life of Joseph Smith and the history of Mormon origins is just simply far better documented than anything regarding the origins of Christianity or the life of Jesus. With this comes both good and bad. The inconsistencies in the story of Mormon origins is also better documented. For example, we have contemporaries who challenged the Joseph Smith priesthood story, whereas no record exists directly challenging the book of John, at least as far as I know. It is important to remember just how thinly documented Christian origins really are. This scholar who wrote an excellent book about the history of Christianity, I don't know how to say his name, but that guy said, quote, "Indeed, one of the earliest known, definitely Christian artifacts is a fragment of text bearing 2 little patches of John's Gospel. The style of its handwriting suggests a date in the 2nd century CE, perhaps within a decade of the first composition of the Gospel. Even then, we have to remember that the vast majority of early Christian texts have perished, and despite many new archaeological finds, there is a bias among those that survived towards texts which later forms of Christianity found acceptable. One expert on the period recently estimated that around 85% of 2nd century Christian texts of which existing sources make mention have gone missing, and the total itself can only represent a fraction of what there once was. The documents which do survive conspire to hide their rooting in historic context. This makes them a gift to biblical literalists who care little for history. If Mormon origins was no better documented than the founding of Christianity, many of the inconsistencies would be completely unknown. While Christian apologists bring attention to the thousands of New Testament manuscripts that have survived, most all of them date to medieval times and later, so that's centuries after. There is nothing from the first century, and the second century is mainly just fragments. Many would challenge the dating James White puts on some of these fragments and manuscripts, but I'm going to go with him because he's a very conservative scholar. And so I think I'm going to go with it because it just still makes my point of where I'm going. So according to him, the first 100 years after the writing of the New Testament, there are 12 fragments. There's the fragment of John's Gospel, P52, from about 125 AD, and Christian apologists get a lot of mileage out of this. It's about the size of a driver's license with a little bit of writing on each side. According to White, there are over 120 fragmented manuscripts within 300 years after the writing. Most New Testament manuscripts are just simply centuries later. Now think about the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants. If either were like the Bible, your first fragment, the size of a driver's license, would not exist until 1870. Then a handful of fragments up until 1935. And there is 115 years to go from currently in 2020 before we can account for another 100 fragments of manuscripts. 2,000 years from now, looking back, scholars would have no idea how much the revelations of Joseph Smith changed because the existence of the 1833 Book of Commandments would be completely unknown. And just bear with me, I'm looking at it. The documentation was scant, so, David Wimmer, anything he wrote didn't survive. And just like we have almost nothing from the first century Christianity. The most significant changes to the Book of Mormon were between 1830 and 1838. If it was anything like the New Testament, you would have no idea these changes were ever even made. It is still significant that even with what we do have in the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, it is the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament that contain the most significant differences, probably due to non-professional copyists. If the development of Christianity was anything like Mormonism, we are completely in the dark of the most significant changes. And we probably will never uncover it all. Mormonism actually provides an excellent case study and example of how quickly an event can grow into a supernatural occurrence that should cause anyone analyzing the very thinly documented early history of Christianity to pause and to think about some things. And that is the story of the transfiguration of Brigham Young of August 8th, 1844. Again, this piece of history close to the beginnings of Mormonism is far better documented than anything in the New Testament. Albert Carrington may have been the first to mention the Transfiguration on the 19th of July, 1857, just 13 years after it allegedly occurred. In the coming years, several told the story, including George Q. And I'm not going to read all them names, all them guys. And most significantly is Wilford Woodruff, John D. Lee, and Orson Hyde left accounts of the occurrence, and we'll get to why that's important. The amount of people reminiscing over either what they themselves had seen that day or what witnesses had told them is massive. Unlike the Gospels, in the case of this transfiguration miracle, we still have the original accounts and by the witnesses, and we know who the witnesses are. There's no question to their authorship. Now imagine if we, again, only had fragments of documents from 19th century Mormonism that included all these reminiscences of it and nothing from the actual period. It would seem concrete that this thing actually happened. So many people talk about it. Even with the differences in the descriptions, you almost couldn't discount it. But we do have more stuff from the 19th century. And the fact is, contemporary accounts, records exist from August 8th, 1844, and there's no mention of this supernatural transfiguration. Wilford Woodruff may have later spoke of this event. He mentions nothing about it in his diary, of which he wrote extensively about the events of that day. John D. Lee and Orson Hyde wrote about the event as though they were there, and yet from contemporary records, we know, in fact, neither were in Nauvoo that day. This small event demonstrates really just how quickly a story can begin in less than 2 decades after an event to such a degree that multiple people begin to recall the occurrence, including people who weren't even there. Memories are weird things. I don't necessarily think they were making it up, that they were there. Unfortunately, such historical analysis of Christian beginnings cannot be as neatly analyzed as Mormonism, and it doesn't matter how much more attestation there is for the New Testament than the Iliad. I hear that all the time about how awesome it is compared to other ancient documents. Christian beginnings are still not well documented. In fact, they are so unwell documented that there are scholars that can actually make the argument that Jesus didn't exist at all, that he wasn't even a person. Now, I'm not among these. I'm not a mythicist myself, but the fact is that they have a case they can make that Jesus didn't even really walk around. This is how many scholars doubt the existence of Joseph Smith? None. That's just a little humor there. And really, if you want to go further back into biblical origins, I mean, no one, Adam and Eve, almost assuredly did not exist. And a lot of scholars don't think Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses existed either. And I covered that extensively last year in my presentation. So, looks like I do have a little bit of time. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. Evangelical critics, they're not only in denial about how difficult it is to reconstruct the Christian movement in those very early years, they also have a problem with ignoring their own historical anachronisms about their origins, while at the same time pointing fingers at Mormons. First Vision's a case in point. I think this one gets over talked about. I think what Steve Harper's written, I think the same book about the First Vision now 3 times. Anyways, it's a favorite, and there's good reasons to question its validity. One of the major problems is the timing. According to the canonized version of 1838, the vision occurred in 1820 in reaction to multiple revivals. However, it is generally understood that there were no revivals in Palmyra in 1820. There is the hypothetical possibility, as proposed by Milton Bachman and Michael Quinn, that revivals and campings happened around Palmyra in 1820, but many believe that Joseph Smith's description fits the large Palmyra revivals of 1824 much better. And therefore, many skeptics find the 1820 first vision as anachronistic, and for good reasons. That said, evangelical critics who preach biblical infallibility and accuracy are ignoring similar anachronisms or turning to their apologists to save the day. And I'm going to just go quickly through these. Get the birth of Jesus. Luke's the only one that mentions the worldwide census. We know there were censuses at the time, but but this one almost certainly didn't happen. The order to kill children under the age of 2 in the book of Matthew. Matthew, amazingly, is the only guy that's aware of it. And not a single other New Testament writer mentions it. And I also want to point out, evangelical critics never miss the Book of Mormon stories that are lifted from the Bible, but somehow miss this story obviously lifted from the story of Moses. Order to kill a deliverer, he escapes to Egypt. I don't know how anyone could really miss it. Another one is when Jesus was born. Matthew, King Herod is one who ordered the infant's death, and Luke mentions that Quirinius was governing Syria, and Herod died in 4 BC, and Quirinius wasn't governor until 6 AD, 9 years later. And apologists play all sorts of games to try to get over that problem. And they like to attack the conflicting origin stories. And again, turning back to the birth of Jesus, major conflicts. I read some creative ways of how they can merge Matthew and Luke together, but it's wild. I mean, separate, they make sense, but try to combine them, you run into all sorts of problems. I think what makes far more sense than thinking that they just didn't mention some important events that the other does, makes far more sense that after the development of Jesus into the Messiah, different traditions arose of how we know he came from Nazareth, how to get him born in Bethlehem. That makes a lot more sense and simple. And of course, you got the resurrection of Jesus discrepancies. Some of these came from, Dan Barker kind of overdoes it. I got some of this from him, but I wanted to include them so I wouldn't be accused of missing anything. The women visit the tomb. The biggest difference is in John, where it's just Mary Magdalene, and that's very important to John's overall narrative, and quite difficult to play the whole games to how merge it. Well, they went to the tomb, went back, went then. Yeah, it's fun. It's funny reading apologists. I mean, these are discrepancies. Well, the one about whether or not they told what happened, that's a big one, especially along, the original ending of Mark, the women don't tell anyone. And that's why I chuckle when I'm told that none of the changes in the New Testament documents are significant. I think changing from women not telling anybody what they saw to they do tell people, I think it's quite a significant change. I don't quite see how people don't think that is. So that's a major discrepancy. What Mary Magdalene did, where he appeared, it's all a little different. But I don't want to belabor that. I taught some of that 2 years ago. So, in conclusion, we see that Both Mormonism and Christianity share inconsistencies and anachronisms in their foundational stories. While the warrior apologists are effective in convincing the already converted, their special pleading and mental gymnastics have little persuasive power with outsiders. Historically, there is no doubt the sources and documentation of Mormon origins is far superior to the beginnings of Christianity. Not that that should be surprising, considering one was 2,000 years ago and one was 200, quite 200 years ago. But that still doesn't change the factual reality that the Mormon record is a lot better. And this includes many of the supernatural claims of Smith being based on eyewitness accounts, and whether it be healings or seeing gold plates and visions. But with better documentation also makes it easier to falsify. Joseph's translation projects are testable. Nothing can be as directly tested in the beginnings of Christianity unless you connect everything and go further back in biblical history to test, the claims of human origins, worldwide flood, Israelite beginnings, such stories that are, for all purposes, been demonstrated to be false. Evangelical ministries to Mormons take advantage of the fact that Mormon beginnings are easier to scrutinize, but the message to save Mormons continue to largely fail. They simply cannot get past the fact they themselves share some identical problems with historical anachronisms and incompatible stories. The sources and documentation of Christian beginnings are so fragmentary that there is large divergence in how to interpret the life of Jesus among scholars seeking to discover the true historical Jesus, including that he did not live at all. What became orthodox in the following centuries ensured the survival of some writings considered in line with orthodoxy, while a great deal of others is even more fragmented or simply lost to history. A questioning Mormon whose shelf is about to break is unlikely to ignore the mountain of problems in Christian claims, having already felt like the wool was pulled over their eyes in Mormonism. The foundation of fundamentalist evangelicals is simply too weak to ever really be effective in converting Mormons. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was excellent. Before we begin the question and answer period, I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative to ask the first question and tell a small anecdote that I want your feedback on. When doing some missionary work, some ministering for my church, Christ Church, in Manti during the Manti pageant that's run by the mainstream LDS Church, we engaged with a whole lot of evangelicals who come there to proselyte. And they were giving this argument about a lack of historical proof of the existence of the Book of Mormon. Or maybe the Book of Mormon, therefore, is not historical, and if not historical, then they say that got rid of the claims of Mormonism. And they were saying, in contrast, the Bible is well attested to. We might not know where Zarahemla is, but we know where Jerusalem is. And I told them, oh, if that's the test you have for whether or not a scripture is inerrant or accurate, let me show you a book of scripture you're going to love. It's called the Doctrine and Covenants, and it mentions places like Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio, and I can show where those places are on a map, and we know where they are. That proves the Doctrine and Covenants must be true doctrine. And they, of course, thought that was not funny, but I thought it was hilarious. And it's kind of an interesting question. So I'm going to follow that up with a question, which is, what do you think about the difference between historical claims and faith claims? As I see you making these comparisons, I want to know, do you think faith claims can be valid even in the absence of historical claims, or even if those historical claims are debunked?
By the way, I'm glad you brought up the Doctrine and Covenants. I thought I was the only one that ever drew that comparison, but I went over that one 2 years ago in the presentation. So that's good. Faith claims and historical claims.
For example, if you can prove that, say, the Transfiguration of Brigham Young, what if we could prove that Brigham Young was not present that day? For example, would that therefore prove that the faith claim, the belief in his transfiguration or his priesthood is invalid because the vision didn't occur? Do you see what I'm trying to draw that parallel?
Yeah. Yeah. So faith in so I mean, yeah, when you're talking history, there's lots of things. I mean, you could say he wasn't there that day. Maybe they got the date wrong, but I do think their historical problems should at least lessen one's confidence in the faith claim.
Okay.
Hopefully that's answering your question.
I think so. I've got some questions from attendees that I'd like to read. The most upvoted one is, how do you feel about the "Are Mormons Christians?" question? We have a separate theology and history. Does that mean it is acceptable to run boundary maintenance that either excludes Mormons or evangelicals? Or are we actually part of the same tradition in your view?
I think that is a debate that both sides need to stop worrying about. But, I look at it this way. If you're a Buddhist living, I don't know, in the middle of India or somewhere, and you've got this really bird's eye view. You're just seeing the forest. You're not getting into the weeds. You're looking over here at America's Christian, mostly Christian. I think if you ran across Mormons, they would probably consider that Christian. Because I don't know that they'd be that worried about all the, three gods in one, three gods in purpose or whatever. So, and there's no doubt Mormonism grew out of Christianity. It's an outgrowth
of separation.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I guess I missed some of your audio. I believe that the last thing I heard was you were saying it was basically about the number of stages of separation. Evangelicals might be able to split hairs, but a Buddhist would see us as very similar.
Yes. Yeah, and Mormonism grew out of Christianity. So I would say I can see it's definitely not Protestant, definitely not Catholic, but it definitely grew out of the Christian tradition. And
right,
so,
and therefore has some heritage in common, at least, right?
Yes, and if I was forced to answer, I would say yes, they're Christian.
Okay.
But I don't worry about it. I don't care.
All right. Here's another question. What is the most polite, careful way to help Christians realize that the Bible might not be inerrant? Is rational conversation possible with a person who accepts biblical inerrancy?
I don't know. I've never done it politely. All seriousness, it's rough. I mean, I've had lots of conversations with them, and they just when you're committed to believing something and you don't want to not believe it, you want to really, really believe it, it's no, I don't. But most of the time I would say no. There's no moving them. They are set in their ways. The most polite way to do it is look up street epistemology. Anthony Magnabosco, how you say his name. That's the polite way to do it. He's got it down. Watch his YouTube channel, the way he does it. That's the polite way.
That is a very cool suggestion. Maybe we should find that URL and put it in the comments section for this session. We've got another question here. What do you think of the Gnostic scriptures and how early those books were written and how wildly different they are from mainstream Christianity?
If I remember correctly, I think some of the Gnostic scripture they're believed to have been written in the 2nd century. I mean, or maybe it was even into the 3rd. Can't quite remember, but it's after the New Testament era. I go along with the mainline New Testament scholarship on that it is later stuff. I know Gospel of Thomas possibly they think pieces of it might be really early, so that's possible, but it's definitely a later version of Christianity.
We've got a comment here from Gazellum Ale. He loves street epistemology as well. There is another question we have here. David Harris asks, I missed the beginning, but I'm curious to know, are you religious? And if so, what flavor? So here's your chance to bear testimony. If you want.
I'm a very devout heathen. No, I'm not religious at all. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. So yeah, not religious at all, but you did come out of the LDS tradition, the mainstream LDS tradition, is that correct?
Yes. But I consider myself a little bit different. I never really, I'm sorry, if things seem to be shaking, it's because I'm bouncing my leg. It's just something I naturally do. I didn't come out mad. I'm not out to enlighten. Well, I guess I kind of am. But I usually focus towards evangelicals. They're a lot funner than Mormons. So yeah, that's what I came out of.
But the evangelicals are more fun? How sad.
Well, they're funner to poke. I mean, I get a lot of fun out of, because to me, the hypocrisy of their message to Mormons is so blatant. I can't see why they don't see it themselves. But when you're in it, it's different. I've been in Mormonism, so I know you just see things different.
It does become more of a culture and a worldview and more than just a church. It's true. Okay, do you have any additional comments for us? It looks like we are out of questions.
No, I guess that's it.
Okay, we're down to the last minute and a half anyway, so I guess our time is up. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want especially to thank Ryan Wimmer, our presenter today, and encourage all of you to come back next year and support Sunstone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend here at Sunstone.
Thank you.